He never signed a treaty. He never accepted a reservation. He never posed for a photograph. While other leaders negotiated, Crazy Horse disappeared into the plains. He did not fight for territory. He fought because a free life could not exist inside fences. To the United States Army, he was not a chief. He was a problem that would not stay in one place. A warrior who could not be predicted, could not be controlled, and would not surrender. Here on Fragments of History, we explore the people history could not assimilate. If you value cinematic historical storytelling, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support this project. Before the fences came, before railroads cut through sacred ground, before treaties turned land into lines on paper, there was a world that moved with the seasons. The Great Plains were not empty. They were alive, a sea of grass rolling from horizon to horizon, broken by river valleys and the black hills rising like dark islands from the earth. This was not wilderness, it was home. It belonged to nations who read weather, tracks, and distance the way others read books. The Lakota did not stay in one place. They followed the buffalo. When the herds drifted north in spring, the camps went north. When winter tightened its grip, they withdrew into protected valleys where cottonwoods softened the wind and game could still be found. A lodge could be taken down in hours. A village could vanish before an outsider understood it had ever been there. Mobility wasn't only survival, it was freedom made practical. At the center of this life stood the horse. Brought north long before, it reshaped everything it touched. A man on foot could hunt. A man on horseback could feed a village. The Lakota became riders early, learning to guide their mounts with knees alone, hands left free for bow, lance, and rope. Speed became a language, distance became small, and the buffalo gave what the plains could not give on their own: meat for food, hides for lodges and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings, hooves for glue, bladders for water. Even dry dung burned clean on treeless ground. To kill a buffalo was to honor it, and to waste any part was an offense, an insult to the spirits that allowed the hunt to succeed. But abundance drew pressure. Crow held territory to the west. Pawnee controlled lands to the south. Shoshone pressed from the mountains. War between tribes was not conquest in the way outsiders would later understand it. It was a test of nerve and skill, a proving ground for the young. A rider might count coup, touch an enemy and ride away untouched, returning with a story instead of a body. People died, yes, but annihilation was not the purpose. The cycles would return. Enemies had to remain for the next season, the next raid, the next generation of boys trying to become men. Spirituality ran through everything like a hidden current. The Lakota did not separate the sacred from the everyday. Hunts began with prayer. Decisions of weight demanded visions. Young men went alone into the wild, fasting for days, stripping themselves down to silence, asking for guidance from Wakantanka, the great mystery that connected all living things. Some returned with nothing but hunger and cold. Some returned changed, carrying a sign that would follow them the rest of their lives. Honor mattered more than wealth. A man who gave away what he owned earned more respect than one who hoarded. Generosity proved strength. To hand your best horse to someone in need was to show you feared neither poverty nor death. Possessions were heavy for a people who lived by movement. What you carried could slow you down. What you clung to could trap you. Leadership was earned, not inherited. A chief led by example and judgment, not by command. If his decisions were poor, people simply followed someone else. Authority flowed from respect, and respect came from deeds. The best hunters fed the village. The bravest warriors protected it. The wisest elders counseled it. No man ruled another by force and called it order. In this world, freedom was not a philosophy. It was the air itself. A Lakota warrior could ride for weeks in any direction and still be within the reach of his people. He answered to no government, paid no taxes, needed no permission to hunt, move, or live. Reputation was law. A man's word mattered because there was nowhere to hide from what others remembered. The seasons turned. The buffalo migrated, the people followed, babies were born in spring camps, names were earned in summer raids, stories were passed through long winter nights until they became part of the bones of the tribe. The world renewed itself in patterns that felt as permanent as the stars. But to the east, beyond the Missouri River, something else was taking shape, something that did not move with seasons. Wooden forts appeared where there had been only open prairie. White men in uniforms marched in straight lines, not reading the land, but imposing themselves on it. They built structures meant to last. They cut and plowed and pinned the earth down, and they killed buffalo by the thousands, sometimes taking only hides, leaving meat to rot under the sun. The Lakota had dealt with whites before, traders seeking furs, trappers slipping through the mountains. These new ones were different. They did not come to trade. They came to stay. And where they stayed, the buffalo thinned, then vanished. Some chiefs rode to the forts to talk. Pipes were smoked, hands were shaken, papers were signed, covered in words the Lakota could not read, sealed by promises they were told to trust. The soldiers said the herds would remain, that the land would remain, that peace would hold. But among the younger warriors, another understanding was forming, quiet at first, then harder to ignore. These promises smelled like smoke from a fire that would consume everything, and one young man, silent, strange even among his own people, kept watching the horizon where the rails would soon cut through the world he knew. A world that would not be defended with raids for honor, but with a kind of war the plains had never seen. He was born with light hair and pale skin, unusual among the Lakota. The other children called him Curly. He did not join their games. While boys his age wrestled and competed for attention, he sat alone by the creek, watching water slide over stone as if it carried messages no one else could hear. His father was a holy man, a Wichashawakan who read visions and guided the people through spiritual matters. The boy grew up inside that world of symbols and silence, learning early that what could not be seen was often more powerful than what could. He listened when elders spoke. He watched when warriors returned from raids. He offered almost nothing of himself in words. His quiet was not timidity, it was attention. While others boasted of the victories they would one day earn, Curly studied how experienced warriors moved, how they used terrain, how they read the moment, how they knew when to strike and when to disappear. He learned without asking. Questions were for those who needed reassurance. He needed only to understand. When he was 13, something in him hardened. A Lakota chief named Conquering Bear was killed by soldiers over a stolen cow, an argument that slipped into gunfire, then into blood. The boy watched the body brought back to camp. He watched grief turn to rage, then to a stunned uncertainty about what came next. That night, he rode alone into the hills without food or water. For 3 days he did not eat. He barely slept. He sang to the spirits. He cut his arms and let his blood fall onto the earth. And on the 3rd night, the vision came. He saw himself riding through enemy fire untouched. Bullets moved around him like wind around stone. A hawk circled above his head. His horse shifted colors beneath him, floating more than running. He wore no war paint, no display, no decorations. A single stone hung behind his ear. The people reached for him, tried to hold him back, but he passed through their hands like smoke. When he returned to camp, exhausted, emptied, his father listened and understood. The boy would become a great warrior, but he would not belong to celebration. He would belong to battle, and those who tried to make him into something familiar, something that could be held and named and claimed, would fail. His father gave him a new name, Tashunke Witko, Crazy Horse. Not because he was mad, but because the horse in his vision moved in ways a horse should not move, untethered by the rules that bound ordinary things. As he grew, Crazy Horse refused what his people expected a rising warrior to become. He did not boast. He did not parade in feathers. He did not cover himself in paint to be remembered. After raids, when others kept the best horses and weapons, he gave everything away. If he returned with 10 captured horses, he kept none, handing them to widows, to families who had lost providers, to anyone whose need was sharper than his own. The others respected this, but it unsettled them. In Lakota life, generosity proved courage. Crazy Horse pushed it beyond courage into something colder and harder to read. He seemed to want nothing, no possessions, no status, no comfort. He slept outside his lodge, even in winter. He ate less than others. He drove his body past its limits, training when others rested, riding when others sought shelter. This discipline was not self-punishment. It was preparation. Crazy Horse sensed what many did not yet want to admit. The world was shifting beneath them, and survival would demand a different kind of warrior. Not one who fought for honor in brief clashes where both sides went home after counting coup, but one who could endure, who could vanish, who could make war into something the enemy could not predict. He studied the soldiers. Where others saw them as clumsy and slow, he noticed their discipline. How they moved in formation, how they obeyed signals, how they fought as a single body rather than as men, hunting personal glory. He watched their supply lines, their patterns, the way they returned to the same habits again and again. He learned them so he could break them. This attention to the enemy made some Lakota uneasy, as if looking too closely invited contamination. In raids, Crazy Horse did not rush ahead for the first touch of honor. He placed himself where he could do the most damage. He waited. He struck only when the moment was clean, when victory was possible, or retreat was certain. Other warriors fought to prove themselves. Crazy Horse fought to win. His name spread, not because he announced it, but because outcomes followed him. Villages he defended did not fall. Raids he led ended with fewer dead. Warriors who rode behind him came home alive. He was not known as the loudest fighter or the most decorated. He was known as the most dangerous because he treated war like reality, not ceremony. Women did not pull at him the way they did other men. He had no wife, no lodge of his own. Some whispered he was not fully human, that the vision had taken something from him and replaced it with something else. He never answered. He simply continued. Solitary training, silent preparation, a life narrowed down to what mattered, because Crazy Horse had seen what his people had not yet fully understood. The soldiers were not coming to raid and leave. They were coming to stay. And when that day arrived, every warrior who fought for personal glory, every chief who bargained for temporary peace, every person who believed the old world would simply continue, they would discover they had trained for the wrong war. Only one man was already bending himself toward what was coming, and he was still learning. The first forts appeared like scars on the land, wooden structures that did not move with the seasons, manned by soldiers who marched in formations the Lakota had never seen. Fort Laramie, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith. Each one stood as a declaration. The United States intended to stay. The government called it progress. They called it manifest destiny, the belief that white civilization had a divine right to spread from ocean to ocean, no matter who already lived in its path. To the Lakota, it was simpler. It was invasion. In 1851, the first Fort Laramie Treaty promised the Lakota would keep their lands forever. The Black Hills, Pahasapa, the heart of Lakota spirituality, would remain untouched. The buffalo ranges would be protected. Peace would hold as long as the grass grew and the water flowed. It lasted only as long as it was useful. When gold was discovered in Montana, miners demanded a route west. The Bozeman Trail was carved straight through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds. No permission was asked. Forts were raised along the trail, troops posted to guard the flow of wagons. When Lakota leaders protested, they were told the forts were for their own protection. Protection from what? The chiefs asked. From us, the soldiers did not say aloud, but the forts were only the front edge. Behind them came the hide hunters, professional killers who shot buffalo not for meat, but for skin. They worked in teams, one shooter with a long-range rifle, others stripping hides and stacking them onto wagons. They could drop 50 in an hour, 100 in a day. They left the meat to rot. They left the bones to bleach white under the sun. After them, the prairie began to stink of death for miles. The Lakota watched their world being cut apart for profit. A buffalo hide sold for a few dollars in eastern markets. A single hunter could earn more in a month than a soldier earned in a year. The herds that had once seemed endless began to thin. The migrations broke their old patterns. Calves starved when their mothers were shot. Regions that had fed villages for generations went quiet, empty of game, empty of certainty. This was not an accident. It was strategy. General William Sherman understood what many officers in the field struggled to accept. The Plains tribes could not be defeated easily in conventional battle. They were too mobile, too skilled, too at home in the terrain. But they could be starved. Kill the buffalo, and the people would be forced into reservations, or into the grave. The reservations were prisons with softer names, parcels of land, usually the worst land, the places settlers did not want, where Indians would be confined, counted, controlled. Government agents would hand out rations. Missionaries would teach children to forget their language. The free life of the plains would be replaced by dependency, surveillance, and hunger that arrived on schedule. Some chiefs chose that path. They saw the numbers. More soldiers arrived each season. More settlers, more railroads, more forts. The United States had endless resources, endless replacements. The Lakota did not. Better to negotiate now, they argued, while there was still something left to negotiate for. Red Cloud, one of the most respected Lakota leaders, tried it. He fought first, besieging forts, cutting supply lines, making the Bozeman Trail so dangerous the government finally agreed to abandon it. Then he traveled to Washington, met with the president, and signed a new treaty in 1868. The Black Hills would remain Lakota land. The unceded territory west of the Missouri River would remain their hunting grounds. In return, Red Cloud would bring his people to the reservation. Crazy Horse refused. He did not attend the negotiations. He did not sign. He did not recognize any government's right to draw lines on a map and call it law. The land belonged to those who lived on it, not to politicians in distant cities who had never tasted buffalo meat or felt prairie wind burn the lungs. Other warriors gathered around him, young men who saw reservation life as a slow death, who preferred to die free rather than live confined. They formed loose bands that moved constantly, raiding supply wagons, striking surveying parties, ambushing small military units that wandered too far from their forts. The government called them hostiles, renegades, troublemakers who refused peace. But to Lakota families still living beyond the reservation boundaries, they were protectors, the last warriors who remembered what freedom looked like and refused to pretend it was negotiable. By 1874, the fragile calm cracked completely. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, treaty land, territory that was supposed to remain untouched. Officially, it was a scientific exploration. In truth, it was meant to confirm rumors of gold. He found it, and he made sure everyone knew. After that, nothing could hold back the flood. Thousands of miners poured into sacred ground. The government made token efforts to stop them, then quietly stopped enforcing the treaty at all. They offered to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota refused. The Black Hills were not property. They were the center of the world, the place where the people went to speak with the spirits. So the government issued a new offer that was not an offer: sell the Black Hills or lose everything. When the Lakota still refused, the ultimatum followed. All Indians were to report to reservations by January 31st, 1876. Anyone still in unceded territory after that date would be declared hostile and subject to military action. It was winter, the coldest months. Moving entire villages through snow and ice was not difficult. It was deadly. The deadline was not meant to be met. It was meant to create an excuse. The message reached Crazy Horse. He did not move. Neither did Sitting Bull. Neither did the hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho families who had never accepted reservation life, and never would. The deadline passed. The government had what it wanted, and the United States Army prepared to do what it had always intended: destroy the last free Indians on the Great Plains. Crazy Horse was no longer only a warrior, he had become the shape of something the government could not tolerate. The refusal to surrender, the insistence that some things mattered more than survival itself. The war that followed would not be about honor or territory or competing claims. It would be about whether a people could choose freedom even when the price was annihilation. The soldiers called him the Ghost, not because they believed in spirits, but because he appeared where he should not be, and vanished when capture seemed certain. One day his warriors struck a supply train in the north. 2 days later they ambushed a patrol 80 miles south. By the time reinforcements arrived, Crazy Horse was gone. No trail, no tracks, nothing left but dead soldiers and burning wagons. It wasn't luck. It was mastery of a kind of war the United States Army had never truly faced. Crazy Horse understood what many commanders did not. On the open plains, the side that moved faster decided the terms of everything. The army traveled with supply wagons, artillery, tents, and months of provisions. They moved at the pace of their slowest wagon. Crazy Horse moved with what his warriors could carry on horseback. They could cover 60 miles in a day. They could change direction without counsels, without orders shouted down a line, simply by following the man at the front. When cavalry units tried to pursue, they found themselves chasing absence. Crazy Horse knew every river crossing, every hidden valley, every place where the land itself could be turned into a weapon. He drew soldiers into broken terrain, where formations collapsed and numbers meant less than footing. In gullies and ridges, the army's discipline became a burden. Men could not maneuver. Horses lost speed. Commands arrived too late. Then warriors hit from multiple sides at once and disappeared before the soldiers could even understand what they were reacting to. His attacks followed no schedule. Sometimes he struck at dawn, sometimes in full daylight. Sometimes he let a patrol pass untouched, waited for them to loosen their grip, then cut them down on the return when they believed the danger had already been left behind. Unpredictability wasn't chaos. It was a tool. It kept soldiers tense, exhausted, jumpy, constantly bracing for an attack that might not come until the moment they stopped bracing. In December 1866, near Fort Phil Kearny, Crazy Horse showed how completely he could turn the army's assumptions against itself. He led a small group of warriors within sight of the fort, making themselves visible, inviting pursuit, offering the kind of target officers wanted to believe in. Captain William Fetterman, who had boasted that with 80 men he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation, took the bait. He led exactly 80 men out of the fort, chasing the small band across open ground. Crazy Horse retreated just out of rifle range, slow enough to keep them hungry, fast enough to keep them chasing. He pulled them farther and farther from safety, over a ridge, into a valley where 2,000 warriors waited in silence. The fight lasted less than an hour. Not one soldier survived. When reinforcements finally reached the field, they found bodies stripped and mutilated, an unmistakable message that this war would not obey white expectations of order or restraint. The Lakota had studied how soldiers fought. Now soldiers were being forced to learn how the Lakota fought. But Crazy Horse's true strength wasn't in a single dramatic slaughter. It was in pressure that never lifted, in attrition that turned every mile into risk, every supply run into a gamble. He struck where the army was exposed, isolated outposts, small patrols, wagon trains separated from escorts. He refused battles that offered the enemy strong positions or overwhelming numbers. He preserved his warriors because every loss mattered. The army could replace men by the thousand, the Lakota could not. To soldiers newly arrived from eastern cities, his knowledge of the land felt unnatural. He read the plains the way they read maps. He knew where water could be found and where it could not, where horses could graze, where camps could vanish from sight, where an escape route existed that looked to an outsider like a dead end. The plains were not empty space to him. They were home, folded with hiding places and pathways only a lifetime could teach. Ambush became his signature. He placed warriors where visibility failed. River crossings, narrow valleys, wooded breaks where the endless prairie briefly stopped being endless. He waited for the moment that mattered, not when the enemy was sharp and ready, but when they were tired, distracted, convinced they had already passed through danger. Then it came all at once. Warriors rose from tall grass 20 yards away. Others appeared on ridges, sealing off retreat. The attack was so sudden, so close, that soldiers barely had time to form a line before it was over. And if the enemy held their ground, if they managed to regroup and prepare to fight, Crazy Horse melted away. He did not spend lives on pride. He struck where he could win, and he vanished where he could not. The effect on morale was slow and ruinous. Soldiers stopped feeling safe. Every sunrise might bring death. Every horizon might conceal riders. Constant vigilance wore men down faster than combat itself. They began seeing threats where there were none. They fired at shadows. They started to fear the open country, not as a landscape, but as an enemy. Reports sent back east made Crazy Horse sound like myth. He could not be tracked. He could not be pinned down. He seemed to know where troops were before they arrived. Some soldiers convinced themselves he was protected, that bullets could not touch him. The truth was simpler and worse. He was just better at this kind of war than they were. Among indigenous camps, morale surged. Young warriors wanted to ride with him. Families confined to reservations whispered his name like a prayer. He proved that resistance was not simply suicide, that the army could be met, hurt, and driven back. Each successful raid drew more fighters to his side. Each ambush fed the belief that surrender was not destiny. The army answered with frustration and brutality. If they could not catch Crazy Horse, they would punish those who fed him, sheltered him, or even spoke well of him. Lodges were burned, food supplies destroyed, horses killed. Winter attacks came when families were most exposed. This was no longer war against warriors. It was war against a way of life. Still, it did not stop him. Crazy Horse moved his camps constantly. He scouted in person, refusing to trust distance or second-hand reports. He outthought commanders trained at West Point, men hardened by the Civil War, men who believed their education made them superior to the people they called savages. By 1876, the Ghost of the Plains had become more than a warrior. He had become a problem large enough to threaten the entire machinery of subjugation. As long as he remained free, the reservations would never be secure. Warriors would always have proof that resistance could work. The army needed something decisive, something that would crush the spirit of defiance in a single blow. They needed to find the hostile bands in one place and destroy them completely. They were about to get their chance, and George Armstrong Custer, hungry for glory, hungry for promotion, was leading the column that believed it would find Crazy Horse first. In June 1876, something happened the United States government had not anticipated. The scattered bands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, people who usually lived in small mobile groups, came together in one place. They gathered along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Not hundreds, thousands. Families who had left the reservations when food rations stopped coming. Warriors who refused to surrender their weapons and horses. Young men chasing one last summer of freedom before the world narrowed into fences. The camp stretched for miles along the river valley, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people, the largest gathering of Plains Indians in living memory. Crazy Horse was there, but he was not in command. Lakota leadership did not work that way. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa holy man, carried the spiritual weight. Gall was a powerful war leader. Two Moons led the Cheyenne contingent. Different bands, different chiefs bound by the same understanding. The army was coming to destroy them, and this time they would meet it together. Crazy Horse spoke little in council. While others debated and made speeches, he prepared. He checked his weapons. He studied the ground. He moved among small groups of warriors, speaking quietly. What he knew about soldiers, where they broke, how they panicked, how formations failed when the land turned against them. 3 columns were moving toward the area. General Terry from the east, Colonel Gibbon from the west, General Crook from the south. The plan was simple. Trap the hostiles between 3 forces and crush them. But Crazy Horse had already met Crook. 8 days earlier at the Rosebud Creek, he had led around 1,000 warriors against Crook's column. and fought them to a standstill. Crook retreated to regroup, and one entire prong of the army's trap dissolved into distance. That left 2 columns, and from the east came the 7th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer was everything Crazy Horse was not. He wanted glory. He wore buckskin, let his hair grow long, and surrounded himself with attention. Reporters followed him, ready to turn his next action into legend. He had political ambitions, maybe even higher than the battlefield. What he needed was a decisive victory, something dramatic enough to seize the nation's imagination. On June 25th, his scouts found the massive encampment along the Little Bighorn. Custer faced a choice: wait for other forces and attack with combined strength, or strike immediately before the village could scatter. He chose speed and spectacle over caution. He split his regiment into 3 battalions, tactics that had worked against smaller camps: hit from multiple directions, drive them into confusion, finish them before they could vanish. But this was not a small village, and these warriors had been waiting for exactly this moment. Custer sent Captain Benteen south to prevent escape. He sent Major Reno to attack the southern end of the camp, and he took 5 companies, about 210 men, north, intending to strike the far end, while Reno drew attention and panic toward himself. Reno attacked first. His men charged across the river into the southern edge of the village, expecting fear, screams, and flight. Instead, they met speed and structure. Warriors poured from lodges, mounted in seconds, and counterattacked hard enough to snap the charge in half. Reno's line collapsed. His men fled in disorder and clawed their way onto a bluff across the river, where they dug in, pinned down for 2 days, listening to what was happening beyond the ridge. Custer never knew Reno had been stopped. He rode north along the ridgeline, searching for a ford, still believing he was striking the edge of something manageable. But Crazy Horse had seen him. While warriors swarmed Reno, Crazy Horse gathered a force and moved toward Custer's column with the speed that had made him a ghost. He understood what Custer was trying to do, and he understood the weakness in it. A split enemy could be destroyed in pieces. Custer reached high ground overlooking the northern end of the camp. From there, the truth rose up at him. Hundreds of lodges, thousands of people, more warriors than he had ammunition to hold back. He tried to pull his men into a defensive position, to retreat toward ground he could anchor, to stabilize what was already slipping. Crazy Horse did not allow it. Warriors crossed the river downstream and swept behind Custer's companies, sealing off retreat. Others pressed from the front. Gaul drove Hunkpapa fighters up from the south. The shape of the fight collapsed in minutes, turning from attack into containment. Custer's men formed a perimeter on the hill. They shot their horses to make barricades of flesh and bone. They fired at riders who stayed just beyond effective range, forcing soldiers to waste precious ammunition. The summer heat pressed down. The wounded cried for water. There was none. Crazy Horse did not throw bodies into rifle fire for drama. He tightened the circle. He coordinated, shifting pressure, closing gaps, denying every line of escape. When small groups tried to break out, they were run down. When others held their ground, they were surrounded and stripped apart. The fighting lasted perhaps an hour, maybe less. It was not a battle unfolding. It was a collapse. Soldiers realized too late that they were the ones trapped, pinned to a hill with no reinforcements coming and nowhere left to run. When the shooting ended, 268 men of the 7th Cavalry lay dead, Custer among them. Not one soldier from his immediate command survived. The news hit the east as the country celebrated its centennial, 100 years of American independence, and the Army's most famous Indian fighter wiped out by the people the government had promised to subjugate. The shock was raw. Newspapers demanded revenge. Politicians called for total war. Whatever remained of negotiation died in that moment. Little Bighorn became the greatest military victory in Plains Indian history. It proved unity could work, that warriors, properly positioned and determined, could destroy professional soldiers. For a brief, brilliant moment, it almost looked like resistance might actually succeed. But Crazy Horse, standing on the field while others celebrated, understood what many did not yet want to see, They had not won a war. They had signed their own death warrant. The United States would not accept humiliation. It would return with everything. More soldiers than could be counted, winter campaigns, scorched earth, and the systematic destruction of everything the Lakota needed to live. And the great gathering would not last. The bands would break apart, scattering, as they always had. When the army returned, it would not come to fight warriors in open battle. It would come to end a people entirely. The celebration lasted 3 days. Then the camp broke apart. The buffalo were moving, and the people had to follow. Bands went in different directions, as they always had. The great gathering dissolved like smoke, returning to the seasonal patterns that had carried the Lakota for generations. But the world that gathering had briefly defied was already turning toward total war. When news of Little Bighorn reached Washington, the reaction was not strategy, it was rage. Newspapers printed lurid illustrations of Custer's last stand. Politicians competed to deliver the most bloodthirsty speeches. The army was given unlimited funding and near-total authority to crush resistance by whatever means would work. General William Sherman, commanding the army, made the intent plain. No more treaties, no more negotiations, no more pretending this was anything but extermination. Hostile Indians would be pursued year-round, in every season, until they surrendered without conditions, or died. The era of summer campaigns followed by winter pause was over. Troops poured into the territories, not only cavalry but infantry, artillery, supply trains built to sustain operations through the hardest months. The army learned from its humiliation. No more splitting forces into fragile pieces. No more underestimating numbers. They would move heavy, move together, and break whatever they found. Colonel Nelson Miles took command of the winter campaign. Where earlier commanders still imagined honorable battle, Miles understood this for what it was. Siege warfare spread across a continent. His target was not warriors, it was survival. He would hunt the bands without relief, deny them rest, deny them hunting time, deny them the ability to prepare for winter. And it worked. Each time a band tried to settle into a winter camp, soldiers appeared. Dawn attacks, lodges burning, food stores smashed, horses captured or killed. They didn't need to kill many warriors. They only needed to keep families moving through snow and cold until exhaustion finished what bullets didn't. Winter became a weapon more reliable than rifles. Families who had survived these plains for generations found themselves unable to hunt, unable to rest, unable to stay warm long enough to recover. Children froze in their mothers' arms. Elders who could not keep pace were left behind. Disease spread through camps that had no time to stop and clean, no time to rebuild, no time to breathe. Starvation took more than combat ever had, and the buffalo vanished. Not only from hide hunters, but from a wider destruction that pushed the remaining herds away from the territories Indians still tried to live on. The migrations that had fed the plains for centuries stopped arriving. Warriors rode out to hunt and found only empty grass where thousands had once moved like weather. One by one, bands surrendered, not because they had been beaten cleanly in battle, but because there was no other door left open. Sitting Bull fled north into Canada. Red Cloud's people had long been on reservations. Even men who had fought at Little Bighorn began appearing at forts, gaunt, hollow-eyed, asking for food for their families. The terms were always the same: surrender weapons, surrender horses, accept reservation confinement, submit to being counted and controlled. In return, there would be rations. Not much, often rotten, frequently late, but still more than could be found on a frozen plain stripped of buffalo. Through it all, Crazy Horse remained free. His band never stayed in one place long enough to be trapped. They survived on what little game could be taken, on roots and bark when there was nothing else. They shared everything, the strong carrying the weak, the hungry dividing scraps, but there was never enough. Hunger became a constant sound in the camp, like wind. Military columns hunted for him specifically. Officers understood that as long as Crazy Horse remained at large, the reservation Indians would never fully submit. He was living proof that resistance still existed, that some Lakota had not bowed. Capturing or killing him became an obsession that traveled with every commander. But he was harder to catch than ever. He moved through blizzards that stopped army columns cold. He used terrain soldiers judged impassable. He survived conditions that killed trained troops. His warriors fought when they had to and vanished when they could. But each fight cost lives that could not be replaced. Each escape left fewer people in the band. Each month on the run made them weaker. By spring 1877, Crazy Horse led fewer than 300 people. More than half were women, children, and elders. His warriors were down to perhaps 80 fighters who could still ride and fight. Ammunition was almost gone. Horses were dying for lack of forage. The children were starving. Messages came from other chiefs. Surrender now, while terms still exist. Keep running and everyone dies. On the reservation, the children will eat. There will be a future, if not the one anyone wanted. Crazy Horse faced what no warrior should be forced to face, principle or survival. He could keep fighting and watch his people die slowly from cold and hunger. Or he could ride into Fort Robinson and accept the end of everything he had lived for. He gathered his warriors and asked what they thought. They were silent. The question answered itself. No buffalo, no ammunition, no strength left to protect the families who had followed him through a winter of hell. To continue was to choose death for people who trusted him to keep them alive. On May 6, 1877, Crazy Horse rode toward Fort Robinson at the head of a column of nearly 900 people, his own band and others who had joined him in the final months. He did not carry a white flag. He sang his death song. Warriors who had followed him for years wept openly. The army called it a victory. Newspapers celebrated the surrender of the last hostile chief. Officers congratulated one another, certain they had finally ended the Northern War. But as Crazy Horse dismounted and handed his weapons to a lieutenant, he looked at the soldiers surrounding him with something the interpreter could not quite translate. Not hatred, not defeat, recognition. They thought this was the end. They thought he would become like the other agency Indians, quiet, dependent, contained. They did not understand that a caged animal can become more dangerous than a free one. And Fort Robinson was about to learn that some men would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Life at Fort Robinson was not peace. It was a different kind of war. Crazy Horse and his people were given a narrow place to camp, rations that never reached enough, and a curtain of surveillance that never lifted. Soldiers watched every movement. Indian scouts working for the army carried reports from lodge to office. A life once defined by open distance was reduced to counting and control. Crazy Horse said little. He set his lodge apart. He refused meetings with officers. He did not sit in councils where reservation chiefs discussed how to survive their new reality. He simply remained, present, silent, and unreadable, a ghost among the living, waiting for something no one could name. Other chiefs watched him with unease. Red Cloud, who had negotiated his own peace years before, saw Crazy Horse as a threat to the fragile stability he had built. If Crazy Horse caused trouble, the army might punish everyone. Better to isolate him. Better to shrink his influence. Better to make the young warriors understand the time for fighting had passed. And then the rumors began. Whispers that Crazy Horse planned to leave the reservation, that he was gathering warriors for one last outbreak, that he had said he would kill the first white man he saw if pushed too far. No one could name the true source. Mistranslations, rivalries, fear dressed up as certainty. But the army heard what it wanted to hear. A dangerous man refusing to be contained. In late August, General George Crook, the same officer Crazy Horse had fought at Rosebud Creek, arrived with a request. The Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, were fighting in Montana. Crook wanted Lakota scouts to help track them. He asked for Crazy Horse. The request moved through interpreters and reached Crazy Horse bent and broken. What Crook asked and what Crazy Horse understood were not the same. The meeting ended in confusion, then suspicion. Officers believed Crazy Horse had threatened violence. Crazy Horse believed he was being pushed into fighting other Indians for white interests. The next day, the order came down. Arrest him. Send him to military prison at Fort Omaha. He was too dangerous to remain free among his own people, even in captivity. On September 5, 1877, Indian police came to his lodge. Men in army uniforms who spoke Lakota. Men who had once ridden as warriors, now serving the government that fed their families. They told Crazy Horse he needed to come to the fort headquarters for a meeting. He knew what it was. But he went. His wife, Black Shawl, was sick. His people had no strength left to resist. If he ran, soldiers would fall on everyone in his camp. He had surrendered to protect them. Now he would face whatever came, for the same reason. He walked toward headquarters surrounded by Indian police and army officers. Other Lakota followed at a distance, feeling the shape of something terrible before it happened. At the adjutant's office, an officer opened the door. Crazy Horse looked inside. Barred windows, chains, the room where prisoners were kept. This was not a meeting. It was a cell. He turned to leave. Little Big Man, an Indian policeman who had once fought beside him, grabbed him from behind. More hands seized him. They tried to force him through the doorway. Crazy Horse fought back, not with a gun, not with arrows, but with the desperate strength of a man who understood that once he entered that room, he would not come out. The struggle spilled outside. Warriors and soldiers crowded in, shouting over one another. Crazy Horse tore free and pulled a knife, not to murder, but to make the point he had made his entire life. He would not be caged. He would die first. A soldier stepped forward. Private William Gentles, 22 years old, ordered to prevent escape. He did not raise his rifle. He used the bayonet. The blade drove into Crazy Horse's lower back, piercing his kidney. The knife fell from his hand. He collapsed into the dirt. Blood spread dark across the ground. For a moment, officers and Indian police stood still, as if the world had stopped long enough for them to understand what they had just done. The man the army could not kill in battle had been stabbed in the back at a reservation fort by a private following orders. They carried him into the adjutant's office, the room he had refused to enter alive, and laid him on the floor. A military surgeon examined the wound and said little. Touched the clouds, his friend sat beside him. His father, the old holy man, came and took his hand. Crazy Horse did not scream. He did not beg. He spoke quietly to his father in Lakota, words the white officers did not understand, and the interpreters did not offer to translate. As night deepened, his breathing grew shallow. He asked to be taken outside, to die under the sky instead of inside a white man's building. They refused. It wasn't safe, they said. There might be trouble. Even dying, he had to remain where he could be controlled. Just before midnight, Crazy Horse stopped breathing. He was about 36 years old. He had been on the reservation 4 months. There was no trial, no formal charge, no investigation that mattered. The Army's report called it an unfortunate incident during the apprehension of a dangerous prisoner. Newspapers in the East barely mentioned it. Another dead Indian. One less problem. That night, his father and stepmother took the body and carried it away. They buried him somewhere on the plains, in a place they never revealed. No headstone, no marker. No site for strangers to visit and pretend they understood what had been taken. The army noted his death and moved on. The Lakota on the reservation whispered his name and said nothing when officers asked questions, and the young warriors who had wanted to ride like him learned the lesson the government intended. Resistance ended in a knife in the back, death on a floor, and a body that vanished into unmarked ground. But in the years that followed, when the buffalo vanished completely, when reservations hardened into permanent cages, when children were taken to schools designed to erase them, the Lakota told stories. Stories of a man who never signed a treaty, who never accepted that freedom could be traded for survival, who fought not because he believed he would win, but because some things were worth dying for. They did not remember him as a defeated general. They remembered him as something more dangerous to empires, the last man who showed them what they had been before the world changed, and what they might have remained if history had turned another way. History tries to make Crazy Horse comprehensible, a general who mastered tactics, a political leader who unified tribes, a symbol of resistance shaped for posterity. But none of those shapes can hold what he actually was. He was not a general. The United States had generals. Men trained at West Point, men who studied European warfare, men who commanded through rank, paperwork, and written orders. Crazy Horse commanded no one in that sense. Warriors followed him because his methods worked and they came home alive. The moment they disagreed, they were free to ride away. On the plains, leadership was not a title, it was proof. His tactical brilliance was real, but it did not come from books. It came from a lifetime of watching, learning that terrain and timing mattered more than numbers, that survival depended on adaptation rather than doctrine. He fought like something hunted that had learned how to hunt back, always alert, always moving, always choosing advantage over display. He was not a politician. Politicians persuade, bargain, compromise. Crazy Horse made no speeches in council. He signed no treaties. He offered no plan for how to coexist with American expansion. When chiefs debated whether to accept reservation life or continue fighting, he often left. His answer was never a platform. It was action. That absence was not naivete. It was clarity. Negotiation required believing both sides wanted peace. The United States did not want peace with free Indians. It wanted land, resources, and the removal of any culture that refused to conform. Signing paper would not change that. It would only make the inevitable look voluntary. He was not a symbol carefully constructed for history. Symbols are built, images controlled, speeches preserved, artifacts collected, monuments raised. Crazy Horse refused all of it. He would not pose for photographs. He gave away what he owned. He kept nothing that could become a relic. He left behind no speeches that could be quoted into comfort. Even his burial place was hidden, so he could not be turned into a destination where strangers could stare and misunderstand. That refusal was radical. Most leaders, even resistors, leave evidence. Letters, recorded words, objects that can be catalogued and explained. Crazy Horse left almost nothing. What remains comes from others. Some who admired him, some who hated him, filtered through translation, rumor, and time. He stays partly unknowable, and that unknowability preserves something true. He was never meant to be understood on the terms of the people who conquered his world. What Crazy Horse really was is simpler and more difficult to face. He was a way of living taken to its final edge. The Lakota valued freedom of movement. Crazy Horse moved constantly, refusing boundaries. The Lakota valued generosity. Crazy Horse gave everything away until he seemed to need nothing. The Lakota valued personal vision over collective conformity. Crazy Horse followed his vision even when it separated him from his own people. He did not invent new values. He refused to dilute old ones. He represented a historical limit, the point where one way of life could not exist beside another. The buffalo hunting world of the plains required vast, open space, mobility, and resources that renewed themselves with the seasons. American expansion required fixed property, permanent settlement, and the conversion of land into farms, towns, and rail lines. These were not competing programs to reconcile. They were incompatible realities. When Crazy Horse fought, he was not fighting for reform, or recognition, or a better treaty. He was fighting for a world that was already collapsing. Each year there were fewer buffalo. Each season brought more settlers. Each treaty tightened the boundaries. He understood, more clearly than those who still hoped negotiation could preserve something, that compromise was only slower death. His refusal to assimilate was not stubbornness. It was recognition. Assimilation meant ceasing to be Lakota in any meaningful sense. Reservation life was not Lakota life adjusted. It was the inversion of everything that had defined it. Fixed boundaries instead of seasonal movement, government rations instead of hunting, dependency instead of self-sufficiency, supervision instead of freedom. Accepting those terms meant accepting that the core of Lakota identity had no future. Crazy Horse embodied freedom not as an abstract political word, but as a lived condition. Freedom to move without permission. Freedom to hunt without licenses. freedom to raise children in traditional ways, freedom to choose leaders without government approval, freedom to live by spiritual beliefs rather than imposed doctrine, and when those freedoms became impossible, when the land itself could no longer support them, he chose death over their absence. This is what makes him dangerous to remember, not because he killed soldiers. Many warriors did that, but because he showed that some people will choose annihilation over transformation, that there are ways of life so fundamental that losing them is a kind of death anyway, that freedom is not always negotiable. The government could kill Crazy Horse, it could confine the Lakota, it could destroy the buffalo, break treaties, and force children into schools designed to erase them. But it could not make any of it legitimate. His existence, his refusal to participate in his own subjugation, exposed the violence required to build what came after. Treaties signed under threat of starvation. Children taken in the name of improvement. Warriors who accepted reservation life to save their families. These were not proofs of triumph. They were proofs of what had to be broken. Crazy Horse was not the last Lakota warrior. Others fought longer, but he was the last who never bent. The last who proved resistance to the end was possible even without hope of victory. The last who showed that some defeats hold more integrity than some survivals. And because he never compromised, never explained himself, never allowed history to domesticate him, he remains what he always was, not a defeated enemy Americans can comfortably admire, but a mirror reflecting what was destroyed to build the country that now claims his memory without understanding what his life actually demanded. Crazy Horse did not lose a war, he lost a world. When the buffalo vanished, when the land was fenced, when survival itself became a crime, there was nothing left to defend. He did not die as a defeated general. He died as something far more dangerous to empires, a man who had never learned how to kneel. If this story mattered, subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like so these documentaries can reach more people. And in the comments, which native warrior should we explore next?